All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Morgan Williams. I'm an economics professor at Barnard College, Columbia University. I'll be presenting some of our joint work entitled Police Force Size and Civilian Race, involving my wonderful co-authors, Aaron Chalfin, Benjamin Hansen, and Emily Weisbers. And so one thing that I think that we want to kind of acknowledge is that probably over the past few years or so, there's been a renewed energy around discussing police reform in the United States. And in no small part is that due to the Black Lives Matter movement and many of the different facets in which they've discussed policing reform and how in ways in which we can improve policing in the United States and elsewhere. But also more recently within this kind of larger defund debate. And of course, if you talk to anyone, defund probably will give you each person will probably give you a different definition of defund. But largely speaking, they're kind of discussing this idea that if we reallocate certain parts of the budget from policing to other kind of interventions or social service agencies, that perhaps we can still see improvements, if not more improvement, in public safety. And so one thing that I think is kind of interesting to kind of discuss is obviously, in thinking about necessarily how to change the scope or the responsibilities of law enforcement, it is important to kind of know exactly what it is that law enforcement does. And so there's been a great deal of evidence. I highlight a very small fraction of that evidence here regarding the importance of police employment, which is a very, very important policy lever that's used by municipal leaders, and also just the visibility of policing, whether it be in hotspot policing or whether it be in other matters. Just having police around sometimes can lead to reductions in crime in meaningful ways. And so one thing that me and my co-authors kind of thought was, well, perhaps there's kind of more to this. This kind of leans into a larger part of my kind of research agenda, and that perhaps these differences in the returns to policing or the cost of policing, so to speak, could differ as we go across Black and white communities. So one example of how different communities could benefit from policing might just involve the fact that there are kind of segregated kind of patterns in street vice. Concentration, or it could just be for the mere fact that Black Americans account for about 13% of the population and over 50% of the homicides. It could be that the allocation of police itself, if the police say, okay, we're going to prioritize homicide as a public safety matter, we might then dedicate some of those policing resources to certain communities more than others. That could lead to efficiency gains. And so, these are some reasons that we could kind of think of police employment in particular, including increasing the police force size, as being a meaningful policy intervention. There's also notable costs that we want to consider. And so to speak, what we've seen surrounding RCTs involving hotspot policing is the idea that perhaps police legitimacy, it seems to change when you engage in these types of practices. But also we have to acknowledge the fact that if we increase, the presence of the police force just in sheer numbers, that also can lead to certain increases in the number of interactions with civilians. And anytime there's an interaction, that could lead to a use of force incident. And so we want to be very careful, given some of the kind of budding literature on the racial disparities in use of force, and we want to kind of see, whether or not the police are doing, a fairly good job in reducing things like homicide victimization, and in addition to their enforcement activity, which is dedicated to addressing some of those concerns. So what are we going to do within this particular study? I'll just kind of get straight to the point. We're interested in estimating the causal impact of increasing the police force size on a number of kind of key outcomes. Primarily being homicide victimization, as I mentioned before. We're also going to look at homicide clearance rates. As a kind of a prelude, we don't find much in the form of homicide clearance rates, but that's noteworthy within itself, and I'll talk about that towards the end of this presentation. We're also going to take a look at different types of arrest or enforcement activity, which will include what we call quality of life arrest, which involve generally these kind of low-level kind of misdemeanor offenses that are generally seen as maybe victimless, but could also kind of lead to a court fine or lead to some other type of criminogenic effect that we might want to be concerned about. But there's also these index arrests, in which we're talking about more serious crime, rape, robbery, murder, etc. And we're also going to kind of acknowledge the fact that with an arrest, they're kind of like two different components. It's what the police do, in addition to what people do in terms of their offending behavior. So we're going to benchmark that against index crimes. And so how do we go about doing this? We put together a sample of about 242 large U.S. cities in the United States based on their population in 1980. We have two different strategies, but this one I'll talk about today focuses on the period from 1990 to 2018. We use a whole, kind of slew of different kind of data sources in order to kind of get at this particular issue. I won't talk about all of them here, but we'll kind of just note that we kind of use different measures of police employment within the paper to our advantage. But in kind of considering this kind of this specific relationship between police foresight and homicide victimization or arrest, there could be a number of different concerns that could come about or in the form of alternative explanations. It could be that, the police employment measures that we use, whether they come from a city manager or whether they come from the police department themselves, could have some measurement error within them. And that measurement error could actually be something that could be quite costly in terms of the precision of our estimates, in addition to the whether or not we have bias within those estimates. We're also concerned with whether or not there might be some omitted variable, or whether or not, the police are able to kind of get ahead or anticipate crime waves, or there might just be some other kind of instance, some other type of source of or predictor of homicide or arrest that we're just not considering. So in that way, we, much of the literature, or a good bit of this literature, is focused on the COPS program, which I'll talk about in a second, and I will kind of focus on exclusively today for the sake of time. So in kind of talking about COPS, the Department of Justice Community-Oriented Police Services Office, it was established under the 1994 Crime Bill with the goal of distributing block grants to police departments throughout the United States. Hiring grants can constitute about half of the funding within this initiative, and the rest kind of going towards technology, targeted crime initiatives, et cetera. COPS grants are reviewed on a number of different factors: fiscal need, application narratives, and other funding constraints. But what we're going to kind of lean on here as a policy experiment is the mere fact that, well, maybe within these grants, there's going to be a number of eligible hires that are specified for each grant that is awarded. So we can account for changes in police employment that are attributable to COPS alone. And so what we see within our particular sample is that the average grant generally is about for $21 million and for about 143 officers, or we kind of see about a 2.5% increase in police employment. So COPS does lead to some significant changes in police employment from one year to the next. And I should also note that the kind of funding availability has changed as we've gone from one administration to the next. So today, again, I will focus on the COPS estimates themselves. Again, we kind of use two different empirical strategies in order to kind of get at this issue. They produce very similar results. As I mentioned before, COPS does lead to meaningful changes in police employment, so I won't talk about those results exclusively today. And we also kind of don't see much in the form of an impact on clearance rates. So how should we interpret the estimates that I'm going to show you in a second? Well, what we're going to see is the point estimates that I'm going to show you is going to be the effect of one additional cop on beta, more or fewer outcomes, whether that be homicide victimization or different types of arrest. But we also kind of know that there's different kind of representation within the population and also in homicide. So one thing that we're also going to do is we're going to kind of benchmark our results to the population and give this to you in per capita terms as well. So what do these estimates kind of show you? This shows you the impact of one additional cop on beta, more or fewer outcomes per 100,000 residents. And so last thing that I will kind of note is that statistically, when obviously want to test the primary focus of this paper is on racial disparities. We want to be able to test whether those effects are statistically distinct from one another. So let's just focus on homicide victimization. Again, what are the effects of hiring one additional officer on homicide by race? Well, again, I'm going to show you a table here. In the left-hand column, I'm going to show you the different kind of outcomes that we'll kind of focus on primarily. And then I'm also going to show you in the next column the coefficient and give you some sense of how precise this is, in addition to the benchmark that's per capita estimate here. And again, we want to be able to kind of provide standard errors. We'll show the mean and the number of observations. So turning to homicide victimization itself, we see here that, again, the marginal officer abates about 0.1 homicides in total, but it's about equal when we go across Black and white homicides. Again, these estimates are not, statistically distinct from one another, as we can see here. But when we look at it in per capita terms, this is indeed the case. And so this means that the public safety gains are larger among Black Americans than white Americans with respect to homicide victimization in per capita terms. This also means that if we want to kind of abate one homicide, that means we need to hire on average about 10 to 17 officers. Next, let's just turn to the question of quality of life arrests. Again, these kind of low-level misdemeanor arrests across racial groups. Again, what we see here is that the marginal officer kind of makes an additional 8 quality life arrests when it involves a Black arrestee and about 14 for whites. One thing that I will note is that unlike the homicide arrests, which account for Hispanic ethnicity, these don't. And so there could be, as we see elsewhere in the literature, many kind of Hispanics being classified as white within this category, which can also change maybe how we kind of view these estimates somewhat. Again, in per capita terms, they're kind of somewhat different, even though the evidence isn't necessarily as strong here. And so we do see meaningful changes in the number of quality life arrests that we should be kind of concerned about. So moving to index arrests and index crimes. One thing I will note is that we cannot break out index crimes by race, but we can again do that for arrests themselves. And so what do we end up seeing here? We see that the marginal officer again makes one fewer arrest for Black arrestees, and then for white arrestees it's about 0.5. If you look at this in per capita terms, this reduction in index arrest is much greater for Black Americans and white Americans. And one thing that we also kind of see here, just as a kind of barometer of sorts, is that not only are police making fewer arrests when we increase the size of the police force, but they're also abating crime, and so they're index crime, and so they're kind of avoiding some of this more serious crime within communities across the country. About 24 for the marginal officer. And so again, this kind of tells us that there could be a double dividend here, in which we're having both reductions in arrests that tend to be accompanied by lengthy prison sentences, in addition to the crime itself. So what is kind of, just to give you a sense of what's going on here, what can kind of be driving these quality life arrests and these index arrests? Well, if we focus on the quality life arrest first, the red kind of points and being the point estimates for Blacks, disaggregated into different categories, the blue ones being for white Americans. And then we're also going to kind of just show you whether or not they were statistically distinct. Here you can see that the racial disparities in quality life arrests are actually concentrated in liquor law violations and drug possession. If we turn to index arrests, we see that much of the crime that the arrests that are being avoided here for these more serious crimes tend to involve robbery, burglary, theft, and motor vehicle theft, things that you would kind of sensibly think of as if you put more cops out on the street, their kind of visibility and their numbers could possibly avoid in much more strategic ways. So just to kind of conclude here, we think that this is kind of really important evidence, kind of thinking about the scope of policing in order to kind of have this larger conversation about policing and what the police should and should not be doing. We should have some sense of what the historical record has to say. Our estimates kind of show you, again, what those historical opportunity costs of investing in one more officer might mean, rather than kind of investing those funds somewhere else. But something, as I kind of noted before, is that we also want to kind of think more clearly about what's kind of increasing police efficiency when it comes down to things like homicide. As I kind of note here, Joe Levy's wonderful book, Homicide, kind of gives us some type of sense of what that policing production function might look like. But this is something that we're going to want to hone in on as we kind of get engaged in future work. I also kind of want to note that there can be an important divergence in both perceived public safety needs and the actual law enforcement practices and policies that are implemented. And so whether it be stop, question, and frisk, or whether it be the type of policing that was taking place in Ferguson, Missouri, these types of policy divergences are important because they can have larger impacts on the police's ability to do their own work in a kind of a general equilibrium sense, but also it can just kind of lead to this kind of this violation of rights and privacy, and also just citizens, just a sense of respect. And so, and wanted to kind of acknowledge these things and also improving better policing, we want to kind of think about what exactly should be kind of the tailored solution to make for many of these communities. As has already been noted, policing itself is not a panacea. And so there are going to be a number of different other interventions that we kind of note here: officer diversity, summer youth employment, CBT, as Sarah's already mentioned earlier in this webinar. So there are other kind of interventions, and we want to think very carefully not only about how these interventions kind of work and how they can kind of serve as maybe a substitute for certain policing responsibilities, but also how they scale up. And so these are all kind of very important considerations within this larger context, but we also want to note that the police themselves seem to be a very kind of important policy lever to kind of think about as we move forward. Thank you.